Good morning and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center and our conversation on climate policy and trade. I'm Sasha Mackler, the Executive Director of the BPC Energy Program. And I'm really excited to get this discussion started today. Climate policy is certainly front and center on both the domestic and international policy agenda right now, with a major focus on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Build Back Better Act in Congress, both containing important climate and clean energy provisions, the international focus at the climate conference in Glasgow right now, and also the recent announcement earlier this week from the Biden administration on a new approach to tariffs between the US and the EU on steel and aluminum sales that will take into account carbon intensity. This intersection between domestic and global climate policies is clearly important and complex, and this connection will be the center of our discussion today. We have a tremendous lineup of speakers, each of them expert on this very important and timely issue. And we will turn to our expert panel here shortly. But first, to kick things off, we have a leading policymaker in Congress as our special guest. Congressman Scott Peters serves California's 52nd congressional district. First elected in 2012, he currently serves on the House Budget Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as the Joint Economic Committee. As a member of Congress, Scott's emphasis has been on promoting and expanding San Diego's innovation ecosystem, advocating for its pivotal role as a partner in national defense, and making government work again. He understands that business problems have bipartisan solutions, which is music to the BPC's ears. He's been a great friend of BPC over the years and is a leading thinker on climate policy. And he's been working on a bill focused on carbon and trade. And we're really eager to hear his views. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Congressman Peters. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this important and timely conversation on climate and trade. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Later this week, I'm planning to attend COP26 and highlight the climate progress we're making here in the United States. And as you mentioned, with the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the Build Back Better Act, we have a pair of transformational bills with big impacts on climate. And I look forward to their final passage, hoping to get that done before I get on the plane for sure. When connecting with my counterparts overseas, I will no doubt be emphasizing the importance of climate and trade. So with the rise of carbon pricing initiatives across the globe and interest in border carbon adjustments in Europe and Canada, we have to act quickly to align United States trade policy with where the world is headed. I want to emphasize at the beginning that I'm pro-trade and pro-climate action. I was one of the Democrats who supported President Obama's position on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but both trade and climate are major challenges for us today. And there's clearly a market failure. Some countries, like our allies in the EU, are moving forward with ambitious climate plans and targets that are aligned with what the science demands. And at the same time, other nations are continuing to subsidize inefficient and dirty coal and not treating climate change like the crisis that it is. Climate change is a global problem, and there's simply no way to address it unless we create an international trade regime around our climate objectives. So while in the past we prioritized cheap products no matter the consequences, today we need to facilitate better trade, but also incorporate our climate priorities. Climate's also an opportunity for the United States, and I reject the idea that we should weaken our environmental standards to compete with other nations. We will remain a global economic leader by raising our ambition to provide the clean products and fuels that the world increasingly is demanding. But as we do this, we have to ensure our policies and our emissions and jobs aren't simply moving to countries with less stringent policies. Through bipartisanship and global cooperation, our goal is to create an alliance of nations that collaborate to raise their mutual climate ambition. So with this in mind, I introduced the Fair Transition and Competition Act with Senator Coons. In short, the bill establishes a border carbon adjustment, or BCA, on carbon-intensive imports to account for the cost incurred by U.S. businesses to comply with laws and regulations limiting greenhouse gas emissions. It requires implementation of the BCA to be consistent with international agreements, including free trade agreements, and requires state and USTR to engage with other countries to ensure fairness in the application of climate-related tariffs. And it uses revenues to invest in high-impact energy innovation and a state grant program focused on transition assistance, environmental justice, and climate resilience. Now, we introduced this bill to accomplish several goals. First, we want to create a global approach to addressing climate change. The U.S. only produces around 10% of global emissions. Most emissions growth is going to come from China and the developing world. This legislation, if coupled with a global inclusive carbon alliance, will help ensure that nations are incentivized to invest in clean technologies. Second, we want to drive a clean, flourishing, and advanced United States energy industry. The U.S. can maintain its energy independence, export its clean energy resources, and address climate change simultaneously. Our plan would ensure that the United States remains the global leader in producing cheap, clean, and reliable energy while protecting United States jobs and reducing reliance on foreign energy sources. Third, we want to strengthen United States competitiveness. Many U.S. businesses are more carbon efficient than their competitors across the world and already comply with many climate laws and regulations. That's certainly true in my home state of California. Our plan will facilitate a race to the top among U.S. companies to produce the next generation of clean energy and technology, and to ensure that United States companies remain globally competitive as they innovate to address the climate crisis. Fourth, we want to maintain U.S. global leadership. The bill will ensure that the United States remains a key player in international cooperation on climate and will show the world that we are fully committed to addressing the climate crisis at home and abroad. And fifth, we want to invest in Americans. The bill invests in high-impact energy innovation to reduce energy costs for consumers and in state grants to ensure an equitable and resilient transition to a clean energy economy. Now, I want to be clear that the bill comes in the nature of an opening offer because we're eager to work with our domestic and international counterparts to find a workable, fair, and effective international climate and trade regime. I believe this can and should be a bipartisan process. Maintaining United States competitiveness and ensuring U.S. companies don't face unfair competition abroad is a bipartisan priority. And simultaneously, we have a national security angle here We have to push back on the Chinese and the Russians and ensure that US energy and technology is dominating the global energy landscape throughout the 21st century. Whether we like it or not, incorporating climate into trade is going to be a part of these efforts. The last thing I'll say is that regardless of the exact climate and energy policies we implement in the coming decades, we will need to focus on developing a new international trade regime that reflects and incorporates climate. That said, I believe that the most effective and efficient way to do this is to establish in the United States, by the way, an economy-wide, technology-neutral price on carbon pollution. Carbon pricing is an essential tool. Even a modest carbon price could generate more than $1 trillion to fund new investments and provide rebates to lower and middle income families, ensuring that any burden falls to polluters instead of working Americans. Pricing carbon pollution will also result in substantial reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, improve local air pollution, and prevent thousands of pollution-related deaths annually. It's unlikely that we can meet our emission reduction goals in time without a carbon price, and maybe unlikely that we will achieve them at all. Now, related to trade, we can no longer ignore developments in other parts of the world. The EU's carbon price is over $60 per ton, and the United Kingdom launched a new program in recent months with a carbon price of $70 per ton. And to the north, Canada plans to increase its carbon tax to $170 per ton by 2030. So if we fail to act, we could face punitive border policies that could hurt US industry and consumers. We have to lead in this space for our economy, for scarcity, for security, and for climate. These policies are becoming increasingly popular as well. In fact, Americans for Carbon Dividends recently found that some 70% of voters support a border carbon adjustment. This includes majorities of conservatives, moderates, and liberals, as well as Republicans, Democrats, and independent voters. We should respond to these preferences and finally adopt a economy-wide carbon polluter fee and a border carbon adjustment. Now, I'm eager to hear your thoughts and work with you to develop the policies we need to fulfill our mutual goals. So thanks for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to seeing some of you, I'm sure, in Scotland next week.
All right. Well, thank you, Congressman, for joining us today and sharing your views and for taking the time and for your leadership on these issues. We will turn now to our expert panel that will be led by my colleague, Zan Fishman. So I will hand the reins over to him.
Hi, I'm Zan Fishman. I am the Director of Energy Policy and Carbon Management here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And I have the privilege of being able to moderate this panel of experts. I'm going to start off with some quick bios, and then we'll get right into questions. First up, we have Dave Banks. Dave's an economist, political analyst, and policy advocate focusing on climate change, energy, and trade. He served as chief strategist for the Republican side of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Banks has published peer-reviewed articles, reports, and opinion editorials on a variety of issues, including climate change, civil nuclear power, and energy markets and trade. A native of Southeast Missouri, Banks was most recently an adjunct research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy and executive vice president at the DC-based American Council on Capital Formation. He was also President Trump's special assistant for international energy and environment at the National Economic and National Security Councils, Republican Deputy Staff Director of the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, Senior Advisor on International Affairs and Climate Change for President George W. Bush, the State Department Foreign Service Officer and CIA Economic Analyst. Michael Mealing is Deputy Director at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT and a Professor of Practice at the University of Strathclyde Law School. He brings 2 decades of experience working on energy and environmental policy with government agencies, private companies, and civil society organizations in North America, Europe, and the developing world. His work focuses on instruments of energy and environmental policy. In recent years, his research interests have included carbon pricing, the international climate negotiations, comparative energy and climate policy, and the drivers and conditions of energy transitions. Katrina Rourke is Vice President for Policy at the Climate Leadership Council. In this role, she develops the details of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends proposal in consultation with 4 dozen founding members. She also manages the council's research program and supports the council's advocacy and outreach activities. Prior to joining the council, Ms. Rourke served as Director of Energy Policy and Senior Fellow at the R Street Institute, where she founded the Institute's Energy and Environment Program. She also previously founded the Energy Program at the American Action Forum. As a legislative assistant to former US Congressman Bob Inglis, Ms. Rourke helped craft the first Republican-sponsored carbon tax bill. And our fourth panelist, Maureen Hinman, is the co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Ms. Hinman, a leading policy expert on environmental industry, most recently served as Director for Environment and Natural Resources at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. At USTR, she led a range of multilateral, regional, and bilateral trade policy initiatives focused on the environmental goods and services sector, as well as natural resource conservation. Ms. Hinman previously served as the US Department of Commerce's Senior Industry Trade Specialist responsible for international policy development and interagency advocacy for the US environmental technology industry. Prior to entering federal service, Hinman consulted on regional integration and trade policy implementation at Nathan Associates, a Washington-based economic policy consultancy. So we've got four amazing experts, and we're here to talk about the intersection between climate policy and trade. And it's a really interesting topic. It's obviously topical right now with COP26. But the bill that we're talking about, or the concept of a border carbon adjustment that Congressman Peters just spoke about, is a new idea that some have talked about as part of carbon pricing. Some have talked about as being its own concept. So I'd like to start off the conversation here with a question to Katrina. Katrina, at the Climate Leadership Council, you guys have published a few really interesting papers related to America's carbon advantage. Could you explain what that means? What is this carbon advantage, and why is that an important concept when we're thinking about climate policy and trade?
I would be happy to. Thanks for having me. So at the Climate Leadership Council, we work on what we call the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividends Plan. It's an economy-wide carbon fee, and one of the features of the plan is to include a border carbon adjustment. We're developing that policy with 48 founding members, including a whole lot of industry actors. And while exploring this concept of a border adjustment with them, we kept hearing these sort of anecdotes that the US might actually be a very clean economy in comparison to many of our competitors. And it sounded right. So the natural gas transition happened really quickly in the United States. The US is particularly good at investing in efficiency, at facility upgrades. So the preconditions were there, but we didn't really have a tool to study whether it was right. And so we built one at the council. Last September, we released our report, America's Carbon Advantage, and it gives us a bird's eye view of the global economy by country, by sector, and it looks at the carbon intensity of economic production. And what we found is that the anecdotes were true. On average, the global economy takes 80% more carbon emissions to create the same dollar of value as we do in the United States. If you look at trade partners like China, India, Russia, we're talking about 3 to 4 times the amount of carbon emissions to create the same exact goods. It's a really profound advantage. And if you look at our report, you'll see that it's not just on average. This carbon advantage is persistent across economic sectors, from raw primary goods all the way through high value finished products. Minerals to microchips, the US is better at producing goods with low carbon intensity than our competitors. So what? Well, we studied that too. Earlier this year, we released what we're calling our steel study. It's a case study about what happens if you take this carbon advantage and you price it. So we took the US steel industry and we introduced a domestic carbon fee and a border adjustment for imported product based on the carbon emissions associated with bringing that steel to the US border. And just by doing this, just by applying the same carbon fee per ton of emissions on the steel industry, what we find is that we cut imports of steel to the US in half, boost sale of US made product about 10%, and increase profitability to the domestic steel industry 40%. Only by pricing the emissions associated with production and asking steel to compete on that basis. So a carbon advantage can become a competitive advantage. And this is the first evidence that we have that we can increase production even of carbon intensive goods in the United States and still be consistent with global decarbonization, and that decarbonization policies can boost investment, jobs, manufacturing in the United States, onshore supply chains, secure supply chains, decarbonized supply chains.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I move on to the next question for the panelists, I want to say that we will be taking audience questions for this panel. So if you are following along and want to tweet with a question, please use the hashtag BPC Live. If you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and leave a question in the chat. Or if you're on Facebook, also go ahead and leave a question in the chat. The next question, I'm going to turn to Michael. The European Commission recently introduced a proposal that would create a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. How do you see that playing out, and what effect will that have on the US?
All right. Well, thanks first of all for having me. This is a tremendously important topic. It's very exciting to see this debate unrolling. Europe has been talking about carbon border adjustments for better part of 15 years now. The first proposals came out of France about mid-2000s. So it's been a topic that's been on the agenda on and off again. The concerns, leakage, competitive, all the same things that we're still discussing now. But it really took a change in the political leadership in the European Commission, so in the executive, if you like, of the EU, to get this agenda really moving forward, because there's been a lot of skepticism and hesitation given the trade implications, the diplomatic implications. And you mentioned correctly that the European Commission now has published a proposed regulation in July, mid-July, that would introduce such a carbon border adjustment mechanism by 2023, but it would really only kick in 2026. And at that point, imports of five categories of goods, steel and iron, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, and electricity, would be hit with a carbon price requirement, the same price that European producers pay under the European carbon market. Now, trying to figure out what that means for the US, it's a bit premature because not all the details have been sorted out on how it would be measured, et cetera. But the impact assessment that the European Commission conducted in drafting and elaborating the rules suggested that the US would be one of the lesser hit countries, one of the lesser hit trade partners. It's really Russia, Turkey, Ukraine that are going to feel the biggest sort of impact of this. There was one figure that suggested about $100 million worth of traded goods between the EU and US would fall under the scope of the CBAM. One important thing, though, is that from the outset, the European Commission said this will expand. And say if it goes beyond those five goods to chemicals, the US would be a lot more exposed. And the second thing, and Dave Banks and I wrote an op-ed, also criticizing this aspect, is that the EU suggests crediting climate policies in trade partner countries that are selling goods to the EU, but only explicit carbon pricing. So right now, for instance, with no federal carbon price, it would be very hard for producers in the US to show, what is the carbon price we pay. Of course, Californian industries, some industries in the Northeast could probably show something, but it's not entirely clear whether they would get credit for that or not.
Thank you. It's interesting, and it seems like what Katrina said earlier about the carbon advantage is directly relevant to those initial five goods. I would imagine maybe we can circle back on that in a bit. But my next question is to Maureen. Maureen, you have a lot of experience negotiating with US trading partners from your time at USTR. How do you see a border carbon adjustment fitting into the broader trade policy ecosystem? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges that this presents for our trade relationships, for our climate ambitions, and for domestic industries and workers?
Well, I want to start by echoing Representative Peters' point, which is that we do have to start thinking about how to reframe our trade policy infrastructure to address this new sort of greenfield area of border adjustment on carbon and the cost of compliance. So, one thing I would mention up front, I think the wind is really at our back in the United States. First of all, because we do have this carbon advantage, as Katrina rightly pointed out. We're a highly competitive country when it comes to our ability to enforce our environmental rules and to create efficiency in manufacturing. So we have a real economic benefit that could be beneficial for the United States in terms of leveling the playing field. Most of the complaints I've heard from US industry over the years has been around the fact, not so much that they don't like complying with US environmental rules, they don't like not having to comply and then having foreign competitors in their own market not have to comply. So that issue of environmental arbitrage, I think, is front of mind for a number of US industries. Now, when it comes to actual instruments, I really think that the wind is at our back in the United States. I have urged partners across the government to really think about existing instruments and reframing those instruments so we can, be leaders in this sort of greenfield area of trade policy. And there's a variety of things that we already do well and we can quantify, and that the government has expertise in implementing efficiently and industry is used to, that I think that we can exploit. So we could commoditize carbon and establish a market that could be very efficient, especially if you think about futures instruments and other sort of financial instruments, really promoting the ability of the financial industry to invest in better solutions. We can level a sort of firm level tax or fee as the EU has proposed. We could level a levelized specific tariff, which is very analogous to existing trade policy, and with even the potential to add a multiplier for things like steel overcapacity, which is a thorn in the side of US metals industry. Furthermore, as Katrina has rightly proposed in her recent paper, we could level a VAT. VATs are very well accepted in international trade policy. Many countries have them, we don't, but it wouldn't be hard for the US to do. One of the ideas that I think is really interesting is maybe establishing an import licensing regime. This could be really valuable because that licensing regime could force trade partners to hand over data that would help us enforce those measures fairly. Furthermore, I think there's also really ample scope for using existing trade remedies, including countervailing duties, anti-dumping duties, and Section 232 duties, as the recent White House announcement kind of foreshadows. All of these policies can be used either independently or in concert. We have lots of options on the table. And I really want to emphasize the part that it's really important to kind of use existing legal frameworks. One thing I did, want to raise is that I think that we've kind of touched on it a bit, but it's really important that we think, kind of do our homework and think comprehensively about this. One thing that keeps me up at night is this sort of potential imbalance between the cost of compliance and the cost of carbon. And creating unintended incentives where maybe if the cost of compliance is higher than the cost of carbon, that might diminish the will to do environmental control on site, or worse, if we've got those differences between countries in a border adjustment mechanism, and we're not really covering full value chain effectively, as both Yuzan and Katrina mentioned, there could be perverse incentives to offshore. So I think that this is a really exciting time. I think we're actually really close, and I hope we're able to get this over the line soon.
Thank you. And I'd like to turn to Dave for a moment to think through the politics of this. Right, we've got a Congressman Peters who just spoke with us about the legislation that he introduced in the House, along with Senator Coons, who's also a Democrat in the Senate. So Dave, where do you think Republicans are on border carbon adjustment policy in general? And is this something they can get behind? Could this be bipartisan?
That's a good question, and that's a question that I often get. I think that we're in a very different place than we were under Kyoto. And this is how I explain the fact that, yes, of course, in my opinion, I think that we could get Republicans behind a bill. And on that point, I do think that the Coons-Peters bill does really help sort of start that conversation. And there are a lot of good things about the bill, some things that I would change, but I think for Republicans, again, I think we need, let's step back a little bit and put things in context. So very different place than we were under Kyoto. Back then, there was no end in sight for U.S. emissions growth. Today, we're on a decarbonization pathway. I think, Katrina was making this point. Now, we could get into a debate on whether it's happening fast enough or deep enough, but the United States is becoming more carbon efficient. Republicans have kind of caught on to this fact, as well as the fact that the United States has had a lot of success in reducing absolute emissions. You'll hear the Republican talking point that we reduced more absolute emissions than any country since 2005, and by a big margin. And then they'll point out at the same time, China has substantially increased emissions. If you look at their current Paris pledge for 2030, they'll probably grow their emissions by at least another 50% compared to a 2010 baseline. Now, why is that important? It's important because it's changed the way folks think, because it's kind of a natural evolution in thought. Hey, if we're reducing our emissions, why would we allow other countries to do so, right? It doesn't make sense for us at this point. This is why a lot of the public talking points on the Paris Agreement have changed. It's been kind of a surprise to me, having worked on international climate policy for some time. But Republicans don't oppose Paris because it's a climate agreement. They now oppose it because, again, it allows other countries to grow their carbon pollution. So they're almost 180 degrees opposite than where they were with Kyoto, when they were arguing against having a binding treaty. But you hear Republicans calling to renegotiate the Paris Agreement or negotiate a new deal that would require other major emitters to cut their emissions. Now, of course, no one is going to renegotiate the Paris Agreement. Any of us who are in the space know that's just not going to happen. So there's only one way you can negotiate a new deal in a way that would force major emitters to reduce their emissions, and that's through trade, okay? And because you can never negotiate a global trade deal related to climate, it's going to have to be with a smaller group of like-minded countries. And this is one of the things I really liked about the Congressman's remarks, right? This emphasis on creating a carbon club, a climate alliance with like-minded countries. Now, those countries, so, we're talking about the US carbon advantage and while we might want to merge climate and trade policy, but those countries that would have the most interest in sort of forming that carbon club with us also have a carbon advantage, meaning that they're more carbon efficient than the global average. Now, it's no surprise, but those happen to be representative democracies, and for a number of reasons. And those representative democracies, guess what, tend to be US treaty allies. The UK, the NATO countries within the EU, Canada, Japan, Australia, and Korea. Well, I'm not sure if Korea has that much of a carbon advantage, but most of the vast majority of our treaty allies do. So for Republicans, I think that there's clearly, and this has been a pretty recent development, there's definitely a lot of support in the high level concept. I don't know if we could get many Republicans today to say, I support a border carbon adjustment, but I do think you could get a lot of Republicans to publicly say, we like the idea of monetizing this carbon advantage that we have. Now, let me just give just a few brief examples on the direction of where the politics are going. Last year, in fact, I think in the early part of last year, the House GOP, including all the leadership and relevant ranking members, sent a letter to the Trump administration, basically asking them to lobby other countries to acknowledge the climate and energy security benefits of them using US natural resources and fossil fuels compared to our competitors. Now, that was kind of a big deal. I know that a lot of my Democratic friends would roll their eyes with pushing US fossil fuels, but getting folks like Steve Scalise and Liz Cheney and a lot of folks who've been really critical of climate policy on board a letter arguing that this produces climate benefits was kind of a big deal. And then you frequently hear this Republican talking point, and I'm sure a lot of my environmental friends are tired of it by now, that US LNG is cleaner than Russian gas and that Europe should choose our production over Russia. But how can you effectuate that? Well, the only way you can is through a climate and trade policy. And then one last point, in the Senate, Senator Kramer from North Dakota sent a letter with 18 other Republican offices criticizing the EU border adjustment proposal. Now, not because it was about climate, and Michael kind of hit this point earlier, but because of the administrative burden it would create for U.S. industry and the fact that it currently does not credit the United States for its decarbonization success, or does not credit the United States fully for its decarbonization success. Importantly, it called for President Biden and the administration to lobby the Europeans to get them to work with us and our treaty allies to develop a common approach to climate and trade policy, recognizing that China represented a major problem when it comes to emissions. So the answer to your question is yes. If we structure the policy the right way, we'll have Republican support. They might talk about it differently, but although I got to say, Congressman Peters, you can tell how bipartisan Congressman Peters is, because he will publicly make the points designed to attract Republicans, right? And that's, look, Republicans would love talking about the importance of gaining U.S. market share, returning the supply chain back to our shores, checking China. But they also like the point that the right policy design, especially in coordination with our allies, would be better for the climate. And if we have a G7 plus agreement, we can create that type of market leverage necessary to accelerate the greening of global supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. One of the things I often focus on is that there really isn't any silver bullet to stopping climate change. There are a lot of separate domestic policies that we need to put in place. There are international agreements and cooperation in helping developing countries. But this new intersection between trade and climate policy is something that I feel like is only now really getting into the conversation. People mostly focused before on domestic policy, international agreements, and haven't focused as much on how can we use trade as a tool. And that comes with trade-offs, like all trade agreements do. Like there are multiple interests to balance. So it's complicated. Trade policy is always complicated. But I think it's very interesting that we just found out this week that the Biden administration is announcing a new trade policy that is directly climate related. They're ending aluminum and steel tariffs with the EU, and for the first time ever, using carbon intensity as a metric that's relevant for trade. So I'd like to open up this question to everybody, and hopefully we can get some free-flowing back and forth conversation. What do you guys think about this new announcement? What do we know so far, and what are the questions that we still need to find answers to? And what is its relevance to a potential border carbon adjustment?
Well, I think it's the open. Sorry, I think it's the opening. I think it's the opening salvo in the matter that we're all discussing here is how do we form a carbon club, and what are the parameters? What are the technical sort of ins and outs? There's a lot of sort of complications about how to form this policy and to do so in ways that are WTO consistent. But, however, I would actually argue that I think that even the WTO now understands that it needs to change in order to address this new area of trade policy and the global economy changing to a greener economy. But I think this is a very important initial step that the Biden administration is taking to start to frame this, what I think eventually will look more like a carbon club.
I agree, Maureen. And interestingly, one of the provisions of this agreement is for the European Union and the United States to collaborate on measuring the emissions associated with steel and aluminum production so that we can come to agreement on the right way to apply existing measurement tools. This is a really crucial step. Right now, we have a lot of data from steel facilities, from aluminum facilities, but we still miss that step of tracing emissions from a facility level to the specific traded goods. We don't trade facilities, we trade items. And so this part of the negotiation between the US and the EU is going to be the first time that international partners are collaborating to decide how to bridge that data gap. And they're doing it for some of the most carbon intensive goods that we trade today, for goods that can give their domestic industry an advantage over dirtier producers. So I think that the sort of focused pressure from individual countries to find a way to sort of beat back unfair trade from dirtier economies is the pressure point to move towards international collaboration on climate and trade. And here we have this perfect example of seizing an opportunity where two partners have a carbon advantage in a specific sector and want to find an opportunity to take a carbon advantage and make it a competitive advantage.
If I can add a reflection from Europe. So it's remarkable how this idea of sub-universal participation, of club, coalition, instead of trying to do things so the UN is taken off. The European Parliament mandated the European Commission with exploring carbon clubs in Glasgow these coming 10 days. The presumptive German Chancellor Olaf Scholz of the Social Democrats credits himself for having introduced this idea. He had a position paper that came out a few weeks ago to create a carbon club and also use or leverage the convening power of the OECD, IMF, G20, etc. Let's see where that goes. But it does speak to something. And I think the underlying observation is, of course, there's the trade challenges on the one hand, the non-market excess capacities that are mentioned, this joint statement of the EU-US, that are a persistent problem in international trade more generally. But there's also just this growing ambition on the climate front. And if we look, because you mentioned, Sam, that this marrying climate and trade, it seems like there's a new momentum there. I think it's inevitable why we're talking about this so much. You look at some countries like, for instance, Switzerland, which is not in the EU, but Sweden is not far behind in this dynamic. They already have managed to eliminate emissions in their own territory so far that they're now importing more embedded emissions in consumer goods that come from China, Turkey, and other countries. And that's obviously not a scenario that any country wants to face. You've outsourced the production, the jobs, the investment, and you still have the global emissions. That's why we need to talk about trade.
Yeah, I totally agree. And by the way, I think that I would make just a couple of points here. Look, I mean, I think what the administration doing is a really good first step. But I do think that it's really important for them to educate the Congress and keep the Congress in the loop as to what's going on. Because look, I mean, we've talked about the fact that this carbon advantage and monetizing it should be a bipartisan. There should be bipartisan consensus around that. But it's hard to do that if you don't have the administration being really active in keeping folks in the loop, particularly up on the Hill. And I know that's difficult at times, having worked, for a couple of different administrations, you get, you're in your own little world. But I think it's really important for them to keep folks engaged on the Hill. But then, and one final point on this, look, again, great first step, but another point that I really like about the Coons-Peters bill is that it goes beyond these kind of the typical energy intensive manufacturers that folks usually talk about when it comes to border carbon adjustment. But they're also looking at including natural gas, crude, coal, fossil fuels in that mix as well. And of course, if you were to have a carbon club with the EU, the US and the EU, there's a big question there. If it includes natural gas, and if we have really good effective measurement, particularly when it comes to methane, then what happens to Nord Stream 2, right? Does it become uncompetitive or not, or too costly at that point? Or does its competitiveness erode compared to US LNG if US LNG is that much cleaner as folks claim it to be?
Thank you. So one of the things I've been thinking about and wondering about is this concept of having a border carbon adjustment as part of carbon pricing, whether that's, there are various ways of enacting some sort of, economy-wide carbon price in the US. And most bills that I've seen that enact a carbon price have a border carbon adjustment built into it. But some people are talking about having a border carbon adjustment policy even absent a broader economic-wide carbon price. How should we think about that? And if it's not built in, how do you even think about the quantification issue that Katrina brought up earlier?
I actually think the quantification issue is a lot easier than many of us are making it, to be honest. If we look at the cost of compliance, which is essentially, that carbon advantage, what we're already earning in carbon for our companies complying with existing US regulation on environment and also existing practice on efficiency. There's many very easy ways to price how in process what technology and services and media are actually being applied in process. The cost, those are production costs that are quantifiable, and those production costs can be easily transferred in terms of the outputs of carbon per unit. So you can very clearly understand per say ton of steel, what your compliance costs are in operation, and what those and transfer that direct cost to the unit of steel.
Dan, I think this is a really interesting question. So the conversation about addressing this gap between climate and trade has focused on the border carbon adjustment because it's the instrument we've been talking about in the US since the negotiations around Waxman-Markey. Maureen has brought up a bevy of alternative instruments that can help us get at this question of climate and trade. But if we want to price emissions from traded goods with a little bit more precision to exploit this carbon advantage for carbon intensive sectors, for the broader economy, linking a border carbon adjustment to a domestic carbon fee is an obviously great way to do this for several reasons. One, we can sort of put aside this question of what the value of the adjustment should be. Maureen offered some shortcuts, but having a domestic carbon price adds a whole lot of clarity. We can impose the border adjustment at the same time as a domestic mitigation policy, which means producers from wherever will face the same exact costs at the same exact time, a really crucial point for our industries that are trade exposed, that engage in long-term contracting, that have tight profit margins. It's a clearly beneficial sort of pairing to have a border adjustment and a domestic carbon price. And crucially, it lets us exploit today's carbon advantage, and it lets us build on that carbon advantage into the future. As the US economy decarbonizes, our carbon advantage, particularly against the Chinas, the Indias, the Russias of the world, will only widen, which gives us even more opportunity to turn our carbon efficiency into competitive opportunity.
Thanks, Katrina. Dave, I might turn to you on this one also. What is there a political case to make that the next entry point here is focusing on the border carbon adjustment by itself, absent separate action?
You mean with it being separated from some kind of carbon pricing or from an international? Exactly. Yeah, I think that look, I mean, I think that most folks would agree that if you had a domestic price on carbon, this policy would be easier to implement. I think that look, you fight the battle with the army you got. Right. And I think that we have a critical mass of interest and support in monetizing the carbon advantage that we have. So I think, and this is the thing, I hate, I don't want to sound like a Democrat when I keep talking about the Coons and Peters bill, but that is what we have out there now. And I do think one of the things I like about it is that it's, the creativity when it comes to, okay, we don't have a price on carbon. We probably won't have a price on carbon anytime soon. So what do we go with? And that may not be where we ultimately land. We may ultimately come up with something else. We may end up coming up with some type of price on carbon. But I think as a starting point right now, they should be delinked.
Got it. I've got some more questions for you, but I want to turn to some questions from the audience because that seems like the right and proper thing to do. So question we have from Rosemary is would a border carbon adjustment put developing countries at a disadvantage in global trade And how should we factor that into how we think about it?
Yeah, we've thought very carefully about this issue. And I think the short answer is yes, it naturally will put developing countries at a disadvantage. I think one of the big shortfalls in the EU proposal is that there's no sort of accounting for special and differentiated treatment for developing countries. One thing that we have been sort of workshopping internally at Silverado is the idea of what we're kind of calling carbon zeroing, where it would work much like a preferences program, where developing countries would be able to forego some of their border adjustment in exchange for qualified purchases of environmental technologies from the United States. This would be a great platform to promote US exports of environmental technology and services, which I think the Dave's team would like, and certainly would give developing countries a pathway to walk up the development ladder and the clean economy ladder, while in the short term being able to still get access to essential foreign exchange on their existing exports.
Can I add a quick sort of comment to that? I agree with Maureen. There's been some concern that the EU's approach, there's so many different variables that any border carbon adjustment, there's so many options that can be put in different ways. And the EU decided not to exempt least developed countries in its proposal. The argument being concerned about transshipment, that if you exempt LDCs, you would suddenly see Chinese steel, for instance, coming in via least developed countries. There's other levers that you could use. And I think Maureen was mentioning a really good one. The revenue coming in, which incidentally will be very little from LDCs, which don't sell that much of these basic commodities to the EU. It's primarily, as I mentioned, Turkey, Russia, etc. But that revenue is a valuable tool that could be used for exactly the kinds of things that Maureen just mentioned, helping with technology transfer, helping least developed countries accelerate their own decarbonization, not only to comply with the border carbon adjustment, but more generally to decarbonize their economies.
Great. So why don't we talk just for a quick second about the elephant in the room, the WTO. I know whenever we start talking about new ideas about trade policy, someone inevitably asks, yeah, but what about the WTO? Is this going to be compliant? Are we opening up a can of worms that it's going to come back and bite us? Like, how should we think about that as we're thinking through a border carbon adjustment? Or
well,
maybe I might turn to you first.
Yeah, I don't mean to steal the floor again, but since I have spent many years negotiating a WTO and certainly spent a lot of time in the hot seat with Congress on WTO matters, I probably, the right person to ask. I think there's kind of two principles we have to bear in mind when it comes to the application of these types of policies. And the first is just comparative effectiveness. We don't have to have the same systems in the world in order for these policies to be WTO compliant. We just have to make sure that we're enabling countries the right to regulate in systems that are comparatively effective. Once we kind of stay in that lane, I think we're mostly safe, which is one of the reasons why I really have tried to push thinking about existing trade policy levers because where they're legal and they're generally, because they're legal, they're compliant. And the other thing we have to kind of think about is really what the sort of framework is of exceptions inside WTO law and what these parameters are. And as I mentioned at the front, I think the whole institution is doing a rethink. I think that the membership has really started to realize that the legal infrastructure that was established, in many instruments as early as the 70s, may not be, a good complement to this new area, and that the infrastructure is going to have to change in order to accommodate, national trade and environmental goals, and accommodate a global economy that is also decarbonizing and green.
I think it's a really interesting suggestion, Maureen. So the European Union introduced its carbon border adjustment mechanism this summer. That is the proposal on the books. But we've also heard this administration talk about border adjustments, this Congress talk about border adjustments. We've heard from Canada, the UK, and Japan about interest in using border adjustment mechanisms and linking them to domestic carbon mitigation strategies. Taken together, that's 53% of the global economy looking to price the carbon emissions coming into their borders. This is an inevitable adjustment to the global trading system. And so while we, as Dave said, fight the battle with the army that you have, and we want to look for ways to be consistent with WTO, we also need to keep in mind that we're envisioning a reframe, and we want to make sure that the US is in the best position possible to benefit from this reframe of global trade. So if we're writing the rules, our domestic industry will have the opportunity to benefit most from this change.
That's an excellent point. I mean, I really have to underscore the idea that we need a first mover advantage. I think the countries and the large economies that lead on this new trade policy infrastructure will be not only playing to their strengths, but also giving themselves opportunities to interweave climate policy and economic development policy. I think we're better off in a world where the United States is vocal in setting the rules of the road, and is thinking dynamically about the impacts to the US economy and the impact to partner economies as well.
Could we dig in just a bit more there? Because I think that's a really interesting point. You know, what are the opportunities of pushing for that first mover advantage? And what are the consequences if we lag behind the rest of the world in moving forward on this?
I think the biggest.
Go ahead.
I think the biggest risk of lagging behind is really tied to how methodology and how we count carbon and how we count, cradle to grave, whether we use a compliance cost in combination with a carbon price, what that price is, what the life cycle analysis looks like. Those are sort of quantitative challenges that the US is actually really good at solving, in terms of a trade negotiation. But if we're, I always like to say, you can be a rule maker or a rule taker. And if we're a rule taker, that could put us at a competitive disadvantage. And we really put ourselves, behind the pack in terms of using these types of instruments for both economic development and climate ambition.
And I would make one quick point. I think that if we're looking to form a carbon club with a critical mass of economies, I think the United States is in a better position to take the lead in doing that. And I'm not saying that because I'm being the ugly American here, versus the Europeans. But I think that just given the national circumstances in the United States, and not the economic and energy profile of the United States, but also the fact that where we are when it comes to regulating carbon and greenhouse gases. I think we're probably more similarly situated with other economies, particularly within the OECD, than the EU is. And so I think that, for the United States and helping, develop a policy design, I think it's probably going to be more compatible with the concept of coming up with a carbon club. I mean, Michael was talking about this earlier, but when the EU, and I agree it should be performance-based when it comes to emissions, but the EU's concept of a carbon club right now, at least to me, looks like it's who's participating in the ETS and has a price on carbon that's similarly structured to what the EU design is. That's a very narrow focus.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I think that having a carbon club could really benefit us in terms of, I think developed countries kind of putting their weapons down and recognizing national, systems are not going to be, identical, but they just need to be analogous to one another. And then worrying really about the problem polluters. I wanted to jump on top of that with the idea that, one of the great things about, as Katrina was mentioning, plurilateral negotiations in the WTO is that they need to cover most of the trade. And among the countries we're envisioning for a carbon club, that's most of the trade. We get to, the members get to set the rules of what critical mass means inside the WTO. But I think the other really sort of, important point here is that, where we're setting the rules of the road and establishing, thoughtful ways to deal with this new area, our international partners are really hungry for our participation. There is, I think, outwardly, some complaints always about the United States being heavy-handed, but, when we're not in the room, we're really missed. And so I think our partners actually would welcome our leadership.
Great. We have just a few minutes left, and I would like to just open up or invite you all, the great panelists, to have any closing thoughts. We probably don't have time for a long closing thought from each of you, but if there's something that we missed, some question that it would have been great if I'd asked if I knew more about this. What are we missing here? What is the thing that you want to make sure we don't close out this event without discussing?
I give it a quick first shot, and it's very brief, and it sort of finalizes the answer that I failed to give in the very initial intervention. You had asked, where will this go with the EU? And the EU has had some initiatives to try to meddle with other countries' emissions. We think of aviation, including aviation in the European emissions trading system about 10 years ago. That backfired. But the atmosphere has changed, the political support, the pressure to move forward. So I think the European CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, this will move through. This has the support of constituencies, of the political institutions. It may change a bit in the negotiations between Parliament and Council, but it will go through. And I think we will not be able to avoid the same kind of debates about trade and climate in all other jurisdictions that have climate ambition in the books.
I'd like to come back to what we're learning in the data. So for the history of the UNFCCC, there's been a perception that being the first aggressive mover on climate mitigation will expose your economy to some amount of pain because you're imposing costs domestically and your international competitors won't face those same costs. It's held back policy. It's been a drag on addressing carbon emissions. And what we're learning in the carbon advantage data is that it's a misconception. Well-designed climate policy can cut emissions very rapidly at the same time that it creates new economic opportunity. And so what we should be looking for at COP and in future international negotiations is indications of this opportunity and a desire to seize on this opportunity. Addressing carbon emissions can be an impetus for economic growth, for more economic success. That's a dramatic change.
Thank you so much. We are unfortunately out of time, even though I would love to keep asking questions and talking with you all about this. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dave. And thank you again to Congressman Peters. This has been a terrific discussion, and I think we'll all have a lot more thinking and research and advocacy to do on all these policies. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens, especially internationally, over the next couple of weeks. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.